Every dynasty has one. The uncle nobody mentions at Thanksgiving. The cousin who disappeared to a ranch in Wyoming and never really came back. The heir who wrapped a Ferrari around a lamppost, or checked into a clinic for the third time, or married someone the family spent 6 figures on lawyers trying to unmarry. Old money families do not talk about this publicly, but privately they plan for it. With the same seriousness they apply to tax law and succession. Because the uncomfortable truth about generational wealth is this: it is never really a story about the smartest child. It's a story about what happens to the other children, the ones who gamble, who drink, who marry badly, who simply cannot be trusted with a checkbook. This video is about the architecture families build to survive that person. Not punish them, contain them. There's a difference, and understanding it tells you almost everything about how real dynastic wealth actually survives past the generation that built it. If you've ever wondered how families with 9-figure fortunes keep one difficult relative from taking the whole thing down with them, stick around. Because the mechanisms are more clever and more cold-blooded than almost anyone expects. Hit subscribe because we go deep into the legal architecture of old money every week, and this is one of the more revealing entries in the series. The taboo: why black sheep is a structural problem, not a moral one. Let's define the term the way estate planners actually use it, because it's broader than addict or criminal. A black sheep, in dynastic planning language, is any family member whose judgment cannot be relied upon to preserve capital, reputation, or family cohesion across a normal human lifetime. That includes substance dependency, compulsive gambling, or chronic overspending. Repeated poor romantic judgment, specifically a pattern of relationships that expose family assets to claims. Mental health crises that impair financial judgment. Simple recklessness, someone who is not addicted to anything, just bad with money and worse with people. The estate planning literature has a blunter way of putting the stakes. Multiple long-running studies of family wealth, cited across the financial planning industry, converge on a now famous statistic. Roughly 70% of family wealth is gone by the second generation, and by the third, as much as 90% has evaporated. That's not usually because of a stock market crash. It's because unstructured money meets an unstructured person, and the money loses. So the black sheep protocol isn't really about shame. It's risk management. A single beneficiary with poor judgment, given unrestricted access to capital, can undo what took 3 generations to build, through a divorce settlement, a business failure they personally guaranteed, an addiction that drains a trust in 5 years instead of 50, or simply a lawsuit that a smarter relative would never have been exposed to. Every mechanism you're about to see exists to solve one narrow specific problem. How do you keep supporting a person you love without letting their decisions become the family's decisions? The original solution: the remittance man. Before trust law caught up to the problem, aristocratic families solved it geographically. In Victorian Britain, a recognized social category emerged for exactly this situation: the remittance man. He was, almost by definition, the black sheep of an upper or middle-class family, sent away from the United Kingdom to somewhere in the Empire, and paid a regular allowance specifically to remain there. The historian Monica Rico traces the term's emergence to the 1880s, describing it as the visible failure of elite British masculinity to function within respectable society at home. The mechanism was blunt but effective. The family avoided daily embarrassment. The son received just enough income to survive, without needing to build a career or a reputation of his own. And critically, the money came with a geographic condition. Stay in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the colonial territories, and the payments continued. Come home, and they didn't. Canadian regional history is full of these figures. Entire valleys in Alberta and Colorado were nicknamed for the density of remittance men living there. Guaranteed for years, whole ranch communities structured their working day loosely around the routines of these subsidized second sons. It's worth being precise about who ended up in this category, because it wasn't only the addicted or the disgraced. Primogeniture law in Britain, unreformed until 1925, meant only the eldest son inherited the family estate. Younger sons, perfectly capable people, were sometimes shipped abroad simply because there was no institutional role for them at home. But a significant subset really were black sheep in the modern sense, men whose gambling debts, drinking, or personal scandals threatened the family name if they stayed close to it. The system conflated surplus heir and problem heir into one export category and simply paid both to stay at a distance. What's notable, watching this from 2 centuries later, is how much of the underlying logic survives intact in modern trust design, even though the tool has completely changed. Distance has been replaced by paperwork, but the core trade, ongoing financial support in exchange for behavioral or geographic conditions, is structurally identical. This pattern, support in exchange for conditions, is going to come up again and again in this video in increasingly sophisticated forms. If you want to see exactly how it evolved into modern trust law, keep watching and drop a comment telling me which old money family's black sheep story you'd want us to dig into next. We read every one of these when planning future episodes. The Modern Architecture, Part 1. The Spendthrift Trust. Modern estate planning replaced exile with structure. The workhorse instrument here is the Spendthrift Trust, and it is worth understanding exactly what it does, because it's almost the opposite of what people assume. A spendthrift trust does not simply control a beneficiary. Legally, its primary function is to restrict the ability of a beneficiary's creditors to reach trust assets to satisfy debts. The trustee retains discretion over how much income or principal to distribute, and until money actually leaves the trust and lands in the beneficiary's hands, creditors cannot touch it. That single design feature does enormous work. It means a black sheep's divorce, business failure, lawsuit, or bankruptcy generally cannot pierce the trust itself, only whatever has already been distributed. For families managing an actual black sheep, this is the first and most important line of defense. The beneficiary can still receive a comfortable, even lavish, standard of living. But the principal, the capital that represents generations of accumulated wealth, sits behind a legal wall the beneficiary himself cannot breach, and neither can anyone he owes money to. Several U.S. states have gone further, competing to attract this kind of planning by weakening or eliminating the old common law rule against perpetuities, the centuries-old requirement, inherited from English law, that a trust must terminate within a lifetime in being plus 21 years. States including Alaska, Delaware, Idaho, Illinois, South Dakota, and Wisconsin have eliminated that rule entirely, opening the door to trusts that can, in principle, run for generations without forced termination, combined with increasingly liberal spendthrift protections. The effect is a jurisdictional marketplace. Families quite literally shop states for the strongest legal walls around a problem heir's inheritance. The Modern Architecture, Part 2. The incentive trust. If the Spendthrift Trust is the wall, the incentive trust is the behavioral lever inside it. This is where dynastic planning gets genuinely fascinating, because it borrows directly from psychology's incentive theory of motivation and applies it to inheritance. An incentive trust ties distributions to conditions, rather than releasing a lump sum at a set age. Instead of a beneficiary simply receiving their share at 25 or 30, the trust can require the beneficiary to hit specific milestones first: completing a degree, maintaining steady employment, matching earned income dollar for dollar with trust distributions, and, for the specific problem this video is about, remaining verifiably drug-free or maintaining documented sobriety. The design logic is explicit in the estate planning literature. Distributions can be structured around a beneficiary's demonstrated values and behavior, not simply their age or their existence as a family member. Grantors can require academic achievement, tie distributions to specific life events, condition access on charitable engagement, or, the more punitive end of the spectrum, include outright withholding provisions that suspend distributions entirely if a beneficiary engages in defined disqualifying conduct. This is also where trustee selection becomes almost as important as the trust document itself. A discretionary trust structure gives the trustee, often a corporate trustee or an independent professional, precisely to avoid family favoritism or resentment, real latitude to increase, decrease, or pause distributions based on the beneficiary's circumstances. For a black sheep specifically, this means the family patriarch or matriarch does not have to personally play warden. An institutional trustee, bound by fiduciary duty rather than family loyalty, becomes the buffer between "we love you" and "we cannot give you unrestricted access to 8 figures." Subtrusts add a further layer of sophistication. Rather than writing one master document for every heir, families increasingly draft a single master trust with individualized subtrusts, different terms, different guardrails, different release schedules, calibrated to what is actually known about each specific beneficiary's tendencies. The dependable heir might receive an outright distribution at 30. The heir with a documented pattern of impulse spending might receive the same dollar amount, staggered across ages 25, 30, and 35. Specifically so, a single relapse or a single bad decade cannot consume the entire inheritance at once. Everything we just walked through is legal, mainstream, and used constantly by estate planning attorneys for exactly this purpose. This isn't some hidden trick, it's publicly documented trust law. But mechanisms only tell half the story. What happens when a family doesn't build this architecture in time? That's next, and it's one of the starkest cautionary tales in 20th century wealth. If this kind of structural analysis is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. So, if you haven't yet, now's a good moment. Case Study 1. The Getty Family and the Cost of No Protocol. The Getty family offers one of the most documented and most brutal illustrations of what happens when enormous wealth meets a genuine black sheep problem, with no containment system in place. J. Paul Getty built one of the great oil fortunes of the 20th century, but the family's internal story across 2 generations reads like a case study in exactly the risks incentive and spendthrift structures are designed to prevent. His son, John Paul Getty Jr., developed a serious drug addiction while living in Morocco in the early 1970s, and his marriage to actress Talitha Pohl ended with her death from a heroin overdose in 1971. The most infamous chapter came in 1973, when Getty Jr.'s teenage son, John Paul Getty III, was kidnapped in Rome and held for a $17 million ransom. The elder Getty, the family patriarch, initially refused to pay, reportedly stating that if he paid one kidnapper, he would soon have 14 kidnapped grandchildren, referencing the number of grandchildren he had at the time. The kidnappers eventually mailed a lock of hair and a severed ear to an Italian newspaper before a reduced ransom, reportedly around $2.2 million, secured the boy's release. What makes this case relevant to a video about black sheep management specifically is what happened afterward, not the kidnapping itself. Getty III was permanently affected by the experience and developed severe drug and alcohol dependency that lasted the rest of his life. A catastrophic mix of substances in 1981 led to a stroke and liver failure that left him permanently disabled until his death, decades later. Even with access to one of the era's greatest fortunes, reporting on the family describes his own father initially resistant to funding his recovery, illustrating that raw wealth, without a structured, depersonalized mechanism for delivering support, does not automatically solve a black sheep problem. It can just as easily become another site of family conflict over who pays, how much, and under what conditions. The family's eventual institutional response is instructive too. Rather than leaving the bulk of his fortune to direct, unstructured heirs, J. Paul Getty directed a large portion of his estate, ultimately over $1 billion, into the J. Paul Getty Trust, now one of the wealthiest arts and cultural institutions in the world. It's a different kind of containment. When a family concludes that dispersing raw capital directly to individual heirs carries too much risk, institutionalizing it into a foundation or trust with its own professional governance is one way to preserve the fortune's purpose while limiting any single heir's ability to damage or be damaged by it. Case study 2. Barbara Hutton and the price of unstructured access. If the Gettys show what happens when family conflict undermines support for a black sheep, Barbara Hutton shows what happens when there is no meaningful structure at all, just raw, early, unrestricted access to a massive fortune. Hutton was heiress to a third of the estate of her grandfather, F.W. Woolworth, the retail chain founder, and became one of the wealthiest women in the world as a child. She lost her mother at age 4 and grew up largely neglected by a father more focused on business than parenting. By the time she gained full access to her fortune at 21, reported at roughly $50 million in inheritance, she had already been dubbed the poor little rich girl by the press, a nickname that stuck for the rest of her life. What followed was a decades-long demonstration of wealth without containment. 7 marriages, several to men widely reported to have targeted her fortune specifically, including an early husband who, biographers note, spent millions of her money on clothes, jewelry, and gifts to other women within roughly 2 years of the wedding. A pattern of addiction, alcohol, prescription misuse, and reported struggles with anorexia compounded the financial erosion across her lifetime. By the time she died in 1979, a fortune that had once been counted in the tens of millions had reportedly dwindled to just a few $1,000s in her account. The instructive detail, for the purposes of this video, isn't the tragedy of Hutton's personal life. Plenty has been written about that elsewhere, and it's genuinely sad. It's the total absence of any structural mechanism between her and her money. No staggered distribution schedule, no spendthrift protection against fortune-hunting spouses, no incentive conditions, no family counsel or professional trustee empowered to say no. A fortune that, structured differently, might easily have supported 5 generations, was instead accessible in full at 21 to someone whose biographers describe as isolated, undereducated in financial matters, and surrounded by people with direct financial incentive to encourage her spending. The mechanisms in the previous section of this video exist in large part precisely to prevent a repeat of this exact scenario. Both of these stories happened, at least partly, because the family had the fortune before it had the framework. The last section of this video covers what modern dynasties do differently, the governance layer that sits above even the trust documents themselves. If you're finding this useful, drop a comment with the word trustee. It helps the algorithm know this kind of deep dive content is worth showing to more people. And I read every comment. The governance layer, family councils, constitutions, and the not at the helm rule. Trusts handle the money, but money is not the only asset a black sheep can threaten. Reputation, business control, and family cohesion are all exposed too. This is where family governance systems come in, and where the most sophisticated dynasties do their real ongoing work. A family constitution, sometimes called a family charter, is a written, if often legally non-binding document that sets out a family's shared values, decision-making protocols, and rules for things like leadership eligibility, employment standards, and succession. Family governance advisors describe 4 common components across almost every serious framework. A mission statement articulating the family's shared purpose, a family council that acts as the governing or legislative body, a family assembly where all members have a voice, and the Constitution itself, which codifies the rules. The Rockefeller family is frequently cited as a working example, even though the family never formally labeled its structure a constitution. At the center of their system sits the Rockefeller Family Council, a standing body that meets regularly to address wealth management, philanthropy, and family unity, giving descendants a forum to voice concerns and resolve disputes without those disputes spilling into business decisions or public view. For black sheep management specifically, the Constitution does something a trust document cannot. It sets eligibility criteria for power, not just for money. A second-generation family business, for instance, might adopt a rule that only members meeting specific education or professional experience requirements can serve in executive roles, a mechanism that doesn't restrict a struggling heir's inheritance, but does quietly and permanently keep them away from decisions that could affect the whole family's capital. This is the not at the helm principle in action. A black sheep can remain fully included as a family member, fully supported financially, and still be structurally prevented from ever controlling the business, the foundation, or the vote. It's worth being honest about a real weakness here, because a good investigative script doesn't oversell its own subject. Family governance advisors are candid that constitutions are often non-binding, and that they can conflict with legally enforceable documents like trust deeds. A constitution might establish a family council with real moral authority, but if the underlying trust deed vests all actual decision-making power in a trustee alone, that council has no formal legal teeth, only the family's collective agreement to respect it. More than half of family offices that fail to reach a third generation, according to industry analysis, do so because of exactly this kind of governance failure. Legal documents that were never harmonized with each other, rather than because of any investment loss. The paperwork exists. The coordination between the pieces of paperwork is where most families actually fail. Synthesis. What the Black Sheep Protocol is really designed to do step back, and the pattern across 2 centuries is remarkably consistent. Whether the tool was a one-way ticket to a colonial ranch or a professionally drafted incentive trust with a sobriety clause, the underlying goal has never changed: separate the person from the capital without severing the person from the family. The old model, the remittance man, was crude and often cruel. It solved the family's embarrassment problem by geography, at the cost of genuine isolation for the person being managed. The modern model is more humane in design, even if it can feel just as controlling to the person on the receiving end of it. Staggered distributions instead of exile, a discretionary trustee instead of a closed door, milestone-based incentives instead of a monthly check contingent only on staying away. What both eras share is the core insight that unstructured access to capital, combined with a genuine pattern of poor judgment, is one of the most reliable ways a fortune disappears. Faster, in most documented cases, than any market downturn ever could. The families who survive intact across 4 and 5 generations are, almost without exception, the ones who accepted early that not every heir would be equipped to handle unrestricted wealth and built the plumbing for that reality before it became an emergency rather than after. That's the actual protocol, not punishment. Plumbing. If this episode gave you a genuinely different way of thinking about how old money actually protects itself, not the mansions, the mechanisms, subscribe, and check the video linked on screen now, where we go inside the dynasty trust structures that make all of this legally possible in the first place. Thanks for watching Old Money Opulence. Every family fortune eventually meets its own black sheep. What separates the dynasties that survive from the ones you've never heard of, because the money simply ran out, is whether the framework was built before or after that person needed it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.